8 red blood cells, and we're going to leave space around them so we can draw some other things around them. Next, we're going to pull off to the side, and we're going to talk about the concept. So important for the immune system, which is probably the hardest lesson this semester, I think. Wouldn't you say the immune system, Michaela?
Mm-hmm.
The immune system? Antigens and antibodies. Antigens and antibodies. Now there's a couple of things that these two structures have in common with each other. Antigens and antibodies are both proteins. They're both proteins. They're both tiny little proteins. And they both have a particular shape that makes them kind of like a receptor or a lock and a key situation. We've talked a lot about receptors, so you understand the concept. You have to have a shape, two things fit together well. When they lock together, then things happen, right? So that's kind of the theme that we're going with here. So an antigen is a membrane-bound protein. I think every time. I've not seen another example of that. An antigen is a membrane-bound protein. Pick up your red markers. We're going to draw some. So what we're going to do on this cell here, this is a red blood cell. We're going to draw some antigens. We're going to draw them pointy. Shape matters. Shape matters. These little pointy things here are antigens. On this cell right here, we're going to draw in blue, we're going to draw a different type of antigen that is round. And we'll start off with that. So we see that there's two different types of antigens on these cells. Now, what an antigen is for in general, what an antigen is for is to denote identity. It's to denote identity. It's to say, this is what I am. The whole world now knows I got this thing sticking out. This is who I am. So an antigen is for identity. It's a protein that's membrane bound, and it denotes identity. In this case, in the ABO blood group, the antigens actually convey the specific type of cell that it is. This here is what we call an A cell because it has A antigens. Guess what this one is? This is a B cell. Does anyone know why it's called a B cell? Because it has B antigens. Have you ever heard of a blood type called AB? What type of antigens does an AB cell have? Very good. It has both A and B antigens. So we're going to draw them both. This guy over here, this is blood type O. And just so you know, blood type O is not actually a type of blood. What blood type O is means that there are no what? No, there's no antigens. There's no antigens. There's no A's and there's no B's. How are we doing so far? Questions? So now let's take a look at our friend the antibody, which is the thing that you've probably heard of before. The antibody, of course, is generated under circumstances where the body is alarmed about something. You generate these little proteins. It's proteins. They're Y-shaped proteins. Get used to that. Y-shaped proteins called antibodies, these are not bound to a membrane, at least not usually. They're not usually bound to a membrane. Usually, antibodies are free floating in the body's fluids. In the blood, in the interstitial fluid, in the lymph, if you know what that is, you will find free floating antibodies. The purpose of an antibody is to bind to what? You know? An antigen. The purpose of an antibody is to bind to an antigen. Especially an antigen that it doesn't like. Especially an antigen that it does not recognize. So, here's where we get to kind of the crux of this. If you're okay so far with the lesson about antigens and antibodies, we now have to move on and start to make some connections that are not as easy at first as you'd think that they would be. So what will happen is you are able to develop antibodies against things that you don't have. Right? So if you have type A antigens, if you're this person, and all of your red blood cells have little pointy things on the outside, will you develop anti-A antibodies? You will not. You can't. There's no way you can. You would be agglutinating your blood. So the next term that we'll come across is agglutination.